And I'll be moderating this session. I'm currently a professor at the School of Government at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Earlier in my career, I served as Executive Director of the Council of State Governments. I want to welcome you to the CSG eCademy webcast about the ins and outs of federalism in the executive branch. Over the years, CSG has played a pivotal role nationally and regionally in advancing the role of the states as laboratories and leaders in America's federal system. The CSG Federalism Task Force is pleased to present a three-part Civics Education Series. This, the first of three eCademy events on federalism's impact across the branches, will examine the current relationship between the federal executive branch and state governments, with a view to providing a fuller understanding of the duties, powers, and limitations inherent in our federal system. We have a lot to get to in the next hour, and I think you'll find the commentary of our three expert panelists to be both intriguing and insightful. After their presentations, we'll have our presenters respond to your comments and questions. This is a very important part of the webinar, and I'd like to encourage you to participate. If you have a question for our presenters, you can type it into the GoToWebinar interface at any time. These will be collated at CSG's headquarters, and then I'll ask as many questions as we have time for at the end of the webcast. I'd like to now introduce our three presenters. I'm going to do so very briefly, and I'd invite our panelists to add anything they care to these brief biographies. Our first speaker will be Ray Shapak, who's Senior Lecturer in Public Policy at the University of Virginia. Ray served as a longtime Executive Director of the National Governors Association. Second, we'll hear from Ingrid Schroeder, who is Director of Fiscal Federalism Initiatives at the Pew Charitable Trusts. And finally, Ed DeSeb, Special Advisor to the President of the United States and Senior Advisor at the Brookings Institution, will speak. Ray was effectively in charge of the Recovery Act. To provide a framework for our webinar conversation today, I'd like to point out several important trends that, in the judgment of many observers of federalism, have disrupted relationships between the federal government and the states. These include federal preemptions of state authority, unfunded mandates, reduced discretionary spending, escalating health care costs, political polarization, unsustainable federal spending, and post-recession state revenue weaknesses. To some, these may lead to a period of fend-for-yourself federalism. At the same time, there are some promising developments that we should be aware of as we talk about federalism in the executive branch. The federal cavalry have come to the assistance of the states from time to time, most notably the economic stimulus package that Ed DeSeb will address, but also more recently in Medicaid expansion. States have resisted unwarranted federal policy intrusions and regulatory coercion, like the Real ID, and have acted in the absence of federal leadership on issues such as minimum wage hikes. Once closed by the Great Recession, the laboratories of democracy in the states have reopened to experiment with promising innovations and best practices. There's growing interest in block grants to help rationalize the more than 1,000 categorical programs and to give state executives more discretion and flexibility in tailoring federal funds to their priorities. And there's been greater use of waivers of federal regulations in areas such as education and healthcare to recognize state capabilities and commitments and the limitations of one-size-fits-all approaches. Federalism observers and advocates like CSG, these developments have raised a number of big questions, which the webinar series will address. 6 of these are on the screen. How will efforts to remedy the federal government's unsustainable fiscal condition affect state and local revenues? How can state governments be viable intergovernmental partners without greater fiscal capacity and fiscal responsibility? Should functional responsibilities in the intergovernmental system be sorted out with turnbacks to the states in order to achieve greater efficiency and effectiveness? Should federal categorical grants be consolidated into block grants to reduce overlap and target resources and improve overall results? What design features should accompany federal economic stimulus programs and regulatory reforms to facilitate more effective state implementation? And under what circumstances Are unfunded federal mandates warranted or unwarranted? When should the federal government preempt state authority or provide waivers for state exemptions and experiments? These are among the big questions confronting intergovernmental relations and why we're here today. The institutions that once addressed these questions are long gone, and there are other impediments posed by current political trends. But for organizations like CSG that are still in the federalism game, these are important opportunities to shape the dialogue and to promote better understanding between the levels of government. That's one of the reasons for this webinar. So let's get underway and hear what our expert panelists have to say about their take on federalism. Let's begin with Ray Shapak.
Unmuted.
Thank you, Carl, and hello, everybody. What I'm going to talk about today really is a very special case around Medicaid provider taxes. It's important because it's the one issue, I think, in the 28 years that I was at NGA, that we were actually able to sit down with an agency and from scratch basically negotiate out an entire bill, go up to the Hill, and have it passed and signed by the President without any amendments. Obviously, when I was at NGA, we negotiated out a lot of specific provisions on bills, but this was the only time that we were actually able to sort of push the administration for the agency to come to the table and negotiate out a very comprehensive bill. I'm going to go to slide 2. I'm going to give quickly just an overview on the provider taxes. States started to do it because they ran into problems, as they usually do on economic downturns, where the cost of Medicaid increases quite dramatically and revenues are declining. And states look for almost anything they can do to sort of get through that particular year without having to make additional cuts halfway through the year or tax increases. So this really started after the recession of '83, which was a pretty bad and deep recession. And essentially they came up with a game so that they could increase the federal share of Medicaid. So what would happen in a number of states is if you were a 50-50 state, you actually could leverage up the federal government to pay 51, 52% by gaming the system. Essentially, the states gained, providers, which are normally hospitals, gained, and the federal government taxpayers lost. They finally got upset about it and promulgated a rule to restrict it, but there were problems about the legality of the rule, whether the HHS really had the legal authority to do it. So we decided that we would oppose it very strongly. So we've got most of the states to sign on for an opposition, but we also work very closely with all the providers, particularly the nursing homes, physician groups, hospitals, and so on, to really raise a fair amount of cane. We also at that time had a Republican chairman, Governor Ashcroft from Missouri, and we worked with him to backdoor the administration to try to get them essentially to come to the table and negotiate with us. Finally, HHS did extend the hand out for us to form a negotiating committee. We did reach agreement. We did enact it. I would say we shut down the most egregious use of donations and taxes, but there are still problems today. Go to the third slide. Anytime you get into this type of negotiation, though, it's very, very challenging, particularly when you're working with 50 states and 5 commonwealths and territories. Essentially, the governors broke into 3 categories. One, those were really blatant users of provider taxes and didn't want to back off any. Second, you had a number that were sort of on moral grounds that it was inappropriate to do it. They not only didn't do it, but they didn't really feel anybody else should be able to do it. And then most of them fell in the middle, which was sort of a moderate use. We at NGA, though, we had basically one person who did most of the human resource things. So we were really at a disadvantage relative to HHS and OMB in terms of expertise. We did finally got a pro bono attorney from Covington to sort of help us. We were always worried because he actually worked for about 20 of the states as well as NGA in this negotiation, but we felt we didn't have much choice. We needed the expertise. So he joined us in terms of helping us negotiate. What you find when you get into this problem, though, each state was very, very unique, and each state had to have a unique solution. So no broad-based solutions essentially would work. And timing was also critical because the rule was going to go into effect in a couple of months. So we had to basically reach agreement in a relatively short period of time. We were always worried that even if we reached agreement, would the Hill enact it without amendments? We tried to keep the Hill involved to some extent, but we never could get a promise that what they would do, essentially. Next slide. So essentially we set up a negotiating team of 6 of us, 3 from the administration, 3 from NGA. From the administration, we had Gail Walensky, who was the head of HICV at the time, and Tom Scully, who was the head of the healthcare pod in OMB. We met weekly as a team. We asked each governor to appoint a staff member who could make decisions. We found over time that it was important for each state to appoint somebody, but oftentimes we did not get people who could make decisions, and sometimes the timing was a problem because they would have to check with other people. We tried to get states to appoint pretty senior people. Most of them did, but some of them did not. So we had to communicate individually, and of course there was no email at that time, so this was all kind of on the telephone work, oftentimes taking 4 or 5 calls to see what would work for individual states. What we found when we get into the negotiation was that the HHS was flexible about the short-run costs. So in the current year, they were willing to let off a little bit. But what they did not want was this to grow very much over the long run. We also tried to get the executive committee with 9 governors so that we were communicating with them all the time, because at the end of the day, they were going to essentially have to vote on the agreement. Go on to the next slide. What did we learn? First thing I think was, once we get into it a while, each side got to be very, very honest about what would fly with their own bosses. So that was very, very important, because in some states we had to push very hard because we knew if we didn't get what they were asking for, we had a huge problem. In other states, we kind of knew that any movement at all would be a victory for them. So we had to lay our cards on the table pretty much about what we needed with respect to each state. They also did that, and so the honesty, I think, over time really helped us get it done. So we had to communicate directly via phone with individual states to be prepared to go back. So we oftentimes would find out that something wouldn't work for a state, we'd put it back on the list, go back and renegotiate. And over a couple month period, some states we were renegotiating 4 and 5 times. Again, we kept the executive committee in the loop both on the substance of the negotiation, but also very specifically with respect to which governors were opposed. And actually the chair and vice chair were pretty good at calling those governors just to check in and get a sense of what their specific problems were. It's also true that the provider community helped us bring them to the table, so we had to keep these stakeholders involved throughout the process, as well as we try to communicate to legislators through NCSL and CSG, sort of where we were in the negotiation. We needed to get a commitment from the administration that they would oppose any legislative changes that we opposed. We were very scared of being hung out to dry, essentially, because the states were the bad guys and the Congress and the administration were the good guys. And we were very fearful that they would do some broad-based things at the end. So we did get a commitment that the administration would oppose if we opposed. We allowed them to take the lead on the Hill because, as I say, they were the good guys. And we needed to have an executive committee vote to adopt the agreement. Actually, as it turned out, according to our bylaws, we really needed to go to the full membership because to endorse a specific bill, we needed to have a vote of 3/4 of the membership. But the executive committee decided to sort of waive that. They were worried they couldn't get it, were willing to take the heat. So they voted it to adopt it and move forward. I had to understand during the process that I personally was in a very risky position because anytime you're the top negotiator, if you lose a small group of states, they can really go after you and create a lot of problems. So you are at a certain amount of risk at the end of the day. The last slide. So I say the final result was actually very, very good. The Congress enacted the agreement without an amendment. And as I said, we're worried about this because, particularly on the House side, we didn't think that Dingell and Waxman were eye to eye necessarily with where we were or where the administration was. But at the end of the day, they basically said, if you two have worked this out, we're fine. We're going to basically enact it. All through the process, I was worried about getting fired, but at the end of the day, it wasn't me. It was the director at HCFA because she did not keep the secretary as informed as she should have. So we did have some casualties at the very end. Most governors, I think, were pleased, but we did have 5 or 6 who were very upset, and that lingered for a while. And so it does hurt the association when you have 4 or 5 that are very, very upset. At the end, I say that the most egregious practices were stopped. Some problems continue, but each state was able to get a unique solution that they needed, which sort of froze the gaming in terms of where it was, so that it did not increase over time and create additional problems. So with that, Carl, I will stop and kick it back to you.
Okay, thanks for a most interesting presentation and case study, Ray. I'm sure there'll be some questions coming back to you about your experience. Now let's turn to Ingrid Schroeder and hear her views on federalism in the executive branch.
Hi, Carl, and thank you, everybody, for including me in this panel discussion. I'm pleased to join. I joined Pew about 5 years ago and had previously worked in the Federal Office of Management and Budget for about 20 years. I joined Pew to run a project on the federal budget, and at the time, Pew already had a pretty well-developed state fiscal health program. We quickly realized that if we joined forces, both the federal side and the state side, that we could explore an area where these policies overlap, specifically in the fiscal area. I like to call it and think about this as like the Venn diagram of looking at policy at the federal and state government. And what Pew is looking at is where the 2 circles overlap. Our fiscal federalism project at Pew aims to unpack this federal-state relationship and examine the relationship and different aspects of it by mapping out how it exists today and where there are potential opportunities for increased collaboration that could lead to better policy and outcomes. Today, I plan to provide a quick overview of how we're looking at federalism issues at Pew through 3 different perspectives. The first one will be to look at the broad fiscal relationship. The second one will be fiscal relationship in a specific policy area, and I'm going to use transportation as an example there. And then the third perspective will be the relationship outside the budget, and I'm going to use immigration as an example. And then to wrap it all up, I'll share some insights about what we've learned through our research and conversations that we've had over the last several years about how federalism works in the executive branch. Pew's fiscal federalism started about 3 years ago, and the team has spent that time exploring and understanding the relationships. So I'm going to begin with this 30,000-foot level and looking at these broad fiscal relationships, if you switch to the next slide, and looking at a map that shows the federal share of state revenue across all 50 states. The darker the blue on this map, the more of the larger the share of state revenue that comes from federal government. In 2013, federal grants provided about 30 cents of each dollar of state revenue. The 30% share means that federal funds are the second largest source of state revenue after states' own taxes. The key takeaway when I look at this map is that it shows the importance of federal funds to state budgets varies widely by state, from a high of about 43% in Mississippi to a low of about 19% in North Dakota. We use this data and other data to show as an indicator showing a state's vulnerability to federal spending changes. Depending on a state's current ratio, if actual spending went down, the state could face some really tough choices in deciding whether to backfill those funds or not. We have a number of other indicators like this on our website, and we encourage you to take a look there as well. Now that we've discussed the broad fiscal relationship, let's shift gears, notice the transportation pun there, and zoom in and look at the fiscal relationship through a specific policy lens. Transportation happens to be the third largest of federal grants to states, behind Medicaid and income security. It also happens to be a policy area that is being actively discussed at the federal level and in the states. And finally, it's a great example to highlight how the federal-state fiscal relationship is intertwined and facing similar challenges, namely shrinking revenues. The most important takeaway from this slide is that all levels of government make a significant contribution to transportation funding, and the funding system as a whole is deeply intertwined. Total funding in 2012 was about $220 billion for transportation infrastructure, of which about $58 billion came from the federal government, $89 billion from state governments, and $73 billion from local governments. Those are the dark green arrows on the left-hand side. But it's important to note that the federal government spends only a small share directly on transportation. If you could switch back to that other slide, great, thanks. Transferring almost all of it, the federal government money to state and local governments. Those are the light green down arrows. The intertwined relationship is important to understand as the federal government debates reauthorization of the Highway Trust Fund and tries to find the funding to compensate for shrinking gas tax revenue. States have to navigate the uncertainty of not knowing when or how much they're going to receive from the federal government. And at the same time, states are also addressing their challenges with shrinking revenue. For example, I think we have about a quarter of the states this year have passed or are presently considering legislation that reform transportation funding, and Iowa just passed a gas tax increase. So what I've just described are the fiscal relationships. We can switch to the next slide. But the relationship between the federal and state governments really is broader than just the fiscal side. There are times where states have to respond to either federal action or inaction that are outside of the federal budget. And we're going to use immigration to talk about this as a good example. It also happens to be the second federalism project that Pew is working on. Pew launched this project, the Immigration in the States project, about 2 years ago, and the aim is to look at immigration from two perspectives. First, at the role that states play in implementing federal legislation and policy, and second, how states are acting in a policy area that has previously been viewed as federal. Today, more than ever, immigration is really a 50-state issue. Over the past 2 decades, the foreign-born population has doubled, and immigrants are increasingly settling in what we call non-traditional receiving states, so states like North Carolina, Maryland, and Washington. As the populations have increased in the states, states have started to take a more active role in immigration matters. Switch to the next slide. This map shows the 12 jurisdictions that have currently enacted legislation that allows unauthorized immigrants to obtain a driver's license. The 2005 federal Real ID law created national standards for state driver's licenses, but it also included a provision that allows states to create alternative licenses that are visually distinctive and cannot be used for federal identification purposes. 8 of the 12 jurisdictions on these maps, highlighted on this map, have began issuing licenses within the past 2 years, and Hawaii actually just passed a law in April to provide them the authority to do so. Most of these jurisdictions are responding to federal action, but each one is taking a different approach. For example, 10 of them are issuing or planning to issue Real ID compliant licenses, and then in Washington and New Mexico, they are not complying with the federal Real ID requirements. The 3 examples I just provided, looking at the broad fiscal relationship through the fiscal indicator, the intertwined fiscal relationship looking at transportation policy, and how states respond to federal actions with immigration and driver's licenses, show the different ways that Pew is looking at federalism. Over the past 3 years, we have learned some important lessons when it comes to looking at federalism issues broadly, and more specifically in the executive branch. Switch to the next slide. The first big lesson that I have to share with you guys, and this probably will not surprise anyone, is that data matters, and it really is needed to fuel a good conversation about state impacts. In 2012, the U.S. Census Bureau stopped producing an extremely important report that provided an annual look at the geographic distribution of federal spending. This report was used by academics, by think tanks, and by states when you were looking at the federal-state relationship and how this relationship worked. This and similar data is extremely important in understanding how federal policies can impact states. And Pew has recreated as best as we could using existing data sources they call it the CFFR, the Consolidated Federal Funds Report. And I'd encourage you to take a look at that. On a similar data note, I would also say don't underestimate the importance of the 50-state analysis. Aggregate impacts on states is very important, but providing state-by-state data really resonates and really can tell a very interesting story. And when doing these kind of analyses, it is really important that a consistent methodology is used across all states. Otherwise, you're really looking at apples and oranges, and it's important to know that you can really look at the states as a whole. To inform our work going forward in this data area, we really are trying to talk to policymakers and find out what kind of data they need to inform their conversations and where this data is missing. A second important lesson is that we need to figure out effective opportunities and venues for federal and state policymakers to meet and discuss these issues. As Carl pointed out, many of the venues that previously existed at the federal government no longer exist. The Advisory Committee on Intergovernmental Relations was abolished in 1996, and other federal executive branch offices no longer exist, or exist more as kind of public relations or outreach offices. Questions we are exploring here include, do policymakers think it would be helpful to have a single entity, either governmental or non-governmental, that can institutionalize the conversation? Or is it better to have ad hoc solutions around specific issue areas or crises to have the conversation, such as the Hurricane Sandy Task Force or the ARA Coordinating Council? And also, we want to explore where do states go when they have questions about federal programs. One of the big advantages that I would say when you're looking at federalism in the executive branch is that there is a little bit more time to have a deliberative conversation with the states. And when I say a little more time, that's in comparison to the legislative process. As policy development is going on in the executive branch and they're working on implementation and regulatory processes, there are oftentimes entry points for states to be part of that conversation, whether it's commenting on a regulation or participating in stakeholder meetings. And I would encourage states to try to figure out and identify these opportunities where the executive branch is trying to hear from states. I have a couple of recent examples where there's evidence that the executive branch is reaching out. The first one is on the Department of Transportation. Their recently issued draft 30-year plan called Beyond Traffic. When they were developing that report, the Department of Transportation reached out to states for their input. And as a matter of fact, Pew hosted a session with the Undersecretary for Policy at the department and state legislators to discuss the impact of federal uncertainty on the states and how states were working on similar issues. Similarly, the White House Task Force on New Americans recently issued a report or action plan on immigrant integration. Pew also hosted several sessions with state and local stakeholders where officials from both the White House and the Department of Homeland Security came armed with pencil and paper and eager to gather state and local input and learn about their efforts. Bottom line, what we've learned is that there are some really good opportunities to engage in discussion and craft policies that understand and acknowledge that there is a relationship between all levels of government. But I also think that there needs to be efforts from both sides to engage in these discussions and use data to move them forward. Hopefully some of the work that Pew is doing can help fuel these conversations and help bring us to a place where we can have more productive conversations about these federal state issues. And that's what I have for today. Thanks, Carl.
Okay. Thank you, Ingrid. Your three examples really very effectively highlighted the diversity among the states and some of the challenges to establishing policy in the federal executive branch, particularly in the absence of intergovernmental institutions like ACIR. So thank you for those thoughts. Now for our grand finale, which will be followed by questions and answers. I'd like to turn the webinar over to Ed DeSev, who will talk about lessons from the Recovery Act. Ed?
Thanks very much, Carl. I'm not in the policy business like Ray and Ingrid and Carl. I'm in the implementation business. Next slide, please. I was able to help the President and the Vice President implement the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And today we're going to talk about the fact that the problem is worse than they knew. Next slide, please. As the President and Vice President and the economic advisors took over, they couldn't see the last 2 gray months to the left of January '09. They didn't know that over 1.5 million jobs were lost in November and December because the data hadn't come in yet. Next slide, please. They didn't know that the current recession was going to be significantly worse than the '81 recession, the '90 recession, or the 2001 recession. It was steeper and deeper. Next slide, please. I got a call from Ron Klain, who is Vice President Biden's Chief of Staff, about 2 days after the act passed, and he asked me to come and see the Vice President. I said, well, I'd always like to see the Vice President. I said, I'm teaching the next couple of days. He said, it doesn't matter. He wants to see you tomorrow. I arrived in the White House and was ushered into his office, and as you can see from the slide, Mr. Biden loves his fireplace. The problem was that I had worn my wool winter suit. He's allowed, although he's not doing it in this picture, to take his coat off. I'm not allowed to do that when I'm with him. So we had a nice chat as sweat began pouring from my head. And he told me that what he really wanted was a CEO, a kick-ass CEO. He didn't say that. A kicking CEO who could run this thing. I said, well, then, sir, you don't want me. Because you have in state governors and in mayors and in department heads people who are CEOs. What you need is an ability to coordinate. Implementation of this act is about coordination. And we'll see that theme running through the slides. Next slide, please. One of the things we learned, and there is, if you go to the IBM Center for the Business of Government website, there's actually a paper I did on this. We learned that, first, attention from the top matters. The President was quite committed to making this thing work. In a cabinet meeting once, he told me that the only thing less popular in Washington, D.C. right now than him was my program. That didn't make me feel good, but what he meant was the program itself wasn't popular, but the elements of the program were. So he was very much engaged. Transparency minimizes fraud. We were very careful to work with folks to do weekly financial reports, which was unheard of in the federal government. We were very careful to do continuous conversations with people in state governments, local governments, and agencies. I'll talk about that later. We had real-time financial information that was available on where the grants were going. We mapped them very carefully with technology. We used GPS solutions to enable people still to be able to look at where the money was going. And finally, we set up networks where collaboration was the essential means of making this thing work. Next slide, please. The fifth objective in the Recovery Act was to make sure that funds were available to state and local governments to make sure that their budgets were stabilized and that counterproductive firing of individuals didn't happen. In other words, keeping school teachers on the job was very clearly a legislative objective written into the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, along with infrastructure spending for old and new infrastructure, along with helping those people most impacted. And these were objectives that were very clear to us. Mr. Biden, Vice President Biden, set up a series of phone calls. He called every governor in America at least once. We worked very closely with the NGA. David Quam was the legislative or the coordination director. We worked very closely with David and his team to make sure that on a bi-weekly basis, the president reached out and talked to governors. We didn't succeed in getting Sarah Palin. We did get her successor, however. He also reached out to counties in phone calls. He also reached out to mayors. And on those calls, he would say, Gov or Govs, what's the problem? What do we got to do to make this thing work better? What are we doing wrong here? What are we doing wrong there? But he also sent them a clear, direct message from the top that their problems were going to be addressed and their issues were going to be listened to very carefully. We worked to create, and that is the folks at OMB and my office worked to create single accountable individuals in federal agencies and single accountabilities in states. So I knew Susie from Minnesota. I knew Charlie from Florida by name. We had phone calls with them probably about twice a month, even outside the calls of the vice president. What that led to was the ability to solve problems very quickly. So Senator Peterson from Kansas stood up on the floor of the Senate and talked about how foolish the Recovery Act was. Because in Kansas, we were going to repave a highway, and immediately thereafter, we were going to start remediating a Superfund site. And the Superfund site trucks would tear up the highway. Vice President heard this. He hears whatever goes on in the Senate. Called me and said, "Fix this, DeSev." Yes, sir. I called the single accountable individual in the Department of Transportation, Deputy Secretary John Porcari. He called his counterpart in Kansas. I called Craig Hooks, the Deputy Administrator of EPA. I called the person in Kansas who was the single accountable individual. Within 24 hours, we had rescheduled the pavement to after the cleanup of the Superfund site. That's the kind of activity that I think built a series of goodwill moments with the states. We had another one that we had with the Energy Department where they were asking for too much data, where we immediately cut back the data call. One of the things that this then did was this created a well-lit house. The Vice President said thieves won't visit a well-lit house. And the fraud and the error rates and the fraud that was alleged in the Recovery Act was significantly less than 1% alleged. And if you go to GAO's reports, you'll see that there was very little prosecution throughout the states or the federal government for fraud, because together, states, localities, nonprofits, the federal government watched very carefully. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through these very quickly. You can come back to them. There were three major legs to the stool. First, about $288 billion of tax benefits. Next slide. $275 billion of grants and contracts and loans for a variety of things, from education to transportation to infrastructure, many of these dollars went directly to state governments and local governments. Highway construction, for example, $19 billion. Of that, a significant portion went for either water, wastewater, or highway construction, with some money in the federal building fund, but the majority of it went right to state and local governments. Next slide, please. The big one, however, was Medicaid grants to states. We changed the formula for the states and made sure that their budgets would not be overtaxed during the recession. We also pumped significant amounts of money into their unemployment insurance programs. And additionally, in places like food stamps, made sure that the fiscal drag that was coming from people being much more disadvantaged was not going to be felt by the states, but rather was going to be felt by the federal government, which is what the Act decided. Next slide, please. When we organized, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this chart, I actually drew this chart myself by hand at one point. What we decided is that we were going to have a network that brought together OMB, brought together the White House and the Vice President's office, all of the agencies, the Inspector Generals, and the grantees in a communication and authority granting situation, which is what this chart tries to show. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And we did this with a real thought that the commitment, that trust, that a structure, that proper governance, access to authority, resources, and leadership were necessary to manage a network. And we shared these with state governments, local governments, other grantees, departments, in order to make this work. Next slide, please. Often the state and local relationship has the characteristics of a Cerberus. This is the three-headed monster. Federal, state, local, snarling and not being able to get forward. We think that in the Recovery Act, we developed a model through networking that allowed us to get to the end state that we desired. Next slide, please. One more, please. Sorry, I'm going to skip over that one today. This is the end state that we really care about. That is, we're all just trying to get along. And that was the objective of the Recovery Act. We think that it's obviously produced a significant number of jobs, whether it's 4.5 million, 5.5 million, you can go debate that, but it's significantly above the 3.5 million. But it also has done some things. When I see the signs on highways and train stations and wastewater plants that are still there, celebrating the funding of the Recovery Act that actually funded these particular activities. So we hope that this is a model for the future for state and local governments to work with the federal government to get big things done. Carl, back to you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ed. I mentioned in the opening that among the promising developments was that the federal cavalry from time to time rides to support and maybe rescue state and local governments, and the Recovery Act is certainly an excellent example of that. I'd like to thank all three of our panelists, both for their thoughts and for their time management. And because of the latter, as well as the former, we have 15 minutes to respond to questions that have been posed, and several have arrived. And I would encourage those who are listening to feel free to submit questions, and we'll cover as many as possible. The first one that came in related to one of the big questions that I posed in my introduction. That had to do with unfunded federal mandates and under what circumstances they were unwarranted, which we've heard a lot about over the years. But are there circumstances in which unfunded federal mandates are warranted? And if so, what might be an example or two of those circumstances? I'd like to ask the panelists if anyone would care to give an example of such an unfunded federal mandate that would be warranted.
Unmuted.
Would be warranted. Ray, in your experience with NGA, did they come up?
Yes, and I was trying to reflect. I mean, I always figure that federal mandates are worthwhile sometimes when the issue has matured, so that the amount of state experimentation is not necessary, and the lack of uniformity is a huge economic cost. I think, for example, you get into food labeling, for example. that's a case where I think it may make sense to have a mandate and move towards uniformity, but generally only after a number of states have moved on it, so that you sort of have a sense about the appropriateness of what you're going to mandate.
Carl, I'm going to take a crack at one. I think clean water and wastewater were the classic federal mandate. The amount of cleanliness now in the river systems and others is dramatically different. And I don't know that localities would have been able to, without significant federal grant funding or without kind of the cover of we've got to do this, have been able to change their wastewater treatment facilities to bring them into the kind of compliance we see today. So I think that's an example of a mandate that was necessary and very, very well done.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn to Ingrid. Questions come in with respect to your example having to do with the 11 states and the District of Columbia, which enacted legislation to provide driver's licenses to the unauthorized. The question was, does it appear that other states are moving in this direction?
There are definitely this is being considered by other states, and we are actually working on a report right now that documents the experiences of the states that have this enacted legislation and some of the things they had to go through and consider as they were putting this into place and implementing it. Things like whether you should translate your driving guides, and how you have to staff up and consider staffing up your motor vehicle departments of motor vehicles. And so what we're trying to do is look at the 12 jurisdictions, the 11 states that have done this, and see if there are any lessons learned and key takeaways for other states that might be considering it.
Follow-up question, Ingrid, tying back to Ray's point about perhaps a circumstance under which a federal mandate might be warranted. When a critical mass of states have taken action along lines of the 11 and District of Columbia, do you think that might call for federal action to ensure national uniformity?
Oh, I don't have a position on that. But I can tell you that when you're looking at unfunded mandates, it's interesting when you start having that federal-state conversation around the unfunded mandates issue. I think it's, you had the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act that set definitions for what it means at the federal level about what an unfunded mandate is. And I think there are often very different perceptions at the state and local level for what an unfunded mandate is. And I think having just a conversation about what we're talking about with an unfunded mandate would be really productive in moving even that conversation forward and making it less of a red meat discussion and more based on the actual facts.
Thanks for that comment. I think we could probably all benefit from greater clarity around some of the key terms that are associated with federalism these days, and mandate is certainly one of those. I have a question. Actually, we have 2 or 3 questions back to Ray Shapak with respect to your negotiations in particular. And one of the questions had to do with the difficulty of getting each governor to appoint a staff member who would make decisions in the negotiation process. And the question was, where are some of the factors that were successful in getting such staff to engage?
Well, generally, we knew that if it was the Medicaid director or even the deputy Medicaid director, the odds were okay. Or third, if it was the senior healthcare budget person in the budget office, we were probably okay. If we got the intergovernmental person, that was our normal contact, we pretty much knew we had a problem. So we would actually talk. I talked to a number of the intergovernmental people and said, look, it would be better if you went back to the governor and asked for somebody more senior, because when this thing gets moving fast, we may call you and need an answer, up or down in 15 minutes, and I don't know that you're going to be able to do that. And actually, we did get a number to go back to their governors and got more senior people. So that's kind of how we approached it. And initially we had some pretty significant problems, but once we turned around some of those, it got a lot better.
Okay. Question for Ed. Just came in. Question basically is, you were clear in your presentation about the importance of transparency. Can you talk some more about some of the major obstacles to transparency that you encountered?
I think the first was my own fear. I had never dealt with the groups and the individuals who were promoting transparency, and I was afraid that if we did our business in public, that it was going to be ugly. It was going to be like sausage making. As it turned out, we were able to negotiate the 99 data elements that we published continuously. Every quarter, we published these data elements, and the folks who were doing the analytics on the other side were very reasonable, very thoughtful, and made good use of the data and shipped it out to people who could see it easily. So I think the first problem was fear, but there was a great deal of comfort within the federal government, and I think once we got over the fear, we were fine.
Okay. Questions come in for Ray. And Ray, you indicated that the most egregious practices have stopped, but many problems remain. And the question has to do with what would you see are the most serious remaining problems in the area that you've covered?
Unmuted.
In the area that you covered.
Well, if you look at the sort of the rules and the law, taxes have to be very, very broad-based. So in other words, if you're taxing hospitals, you have to tax them all basically at the same rate. And so what you find some states doing is, main hospitals, they do at one rate, and maybe rural hospitals at another rate, or specialized hospitals. So they push on the margin on that, and really the broad-based is one of the major components of the provider tax law. So they don't live up to it totally, but they're close enough that they don't get in a lot of trouble. But you'll see, like, states are still struggling sort of economically, revenue-wise. I suspect if we do go into another dip, you're going to find them back pushing on that margin again.
Okay, thank you. Ingrid, you mentioned in the close of your presentation the loss of some of the institutions that once paid close attention to some of the trends and issues and friction points in intergovernmental relations. ACIR, the OMB, Intergovernmental Unit, House and Senate subcommittees, and others, organizations that are no longer with us. Do you see any promising prospects for a rebirth of one of those organizations, or establishment of a capacity to look at the intergovernmental trends and issues, convene representatives from across the branches and the levels of government, or is that pretty much a time that has come and gone?
Well, I've seen pockets of areas where there are, particularly in the executive branch, where they are reaching out to states and trying to get their input, whether it's part of the regulatory process or in conjunction with some of these ad hoc task forces that are created. I have not seen any major movement to recreate an ACIR or those kind of institutions that had previously existed. And one of the things that we're really trying to figure out here through conversations in the legislative branch and the executive branch at the federal level, and also talking to states, is what actually would be the most useful venue to have these conversations. Is one institution the way to do it, or is it better focused on specific policy areas? Like, should there be, when you're looking at the Highway Trust Fund, a group to talk about the Highway Trust Fund reauthorization? Or as Ray said, when you were looking at the issues that they were at NGA on Medicaid provider taxes, was that because it was a single issue that they could coalesce around a topic and have that kind of good, productive conversation? So that's the kind of conversations we're having both at the federal and state level to find out from both sides where they think those productive conversations could happen and where are the pockets where they are happening today.
Great, thanks, Ingrid. As we wrap up our webinar, I'd like to invite Ed and Ray to comment on this last question as well regarding the intergovernmental institutions.
Unmuted.
You want to go ahead?
One of the things I did over the last several years was to work with Dick Ravitch and Paul Volcker on the State Budget Crisis Task Force. And so I spent a lot of time talking directly to governors and finance directors about the nature of the problems that they had. There was no real intermediary group. Certainly NGA does a great job, the state budget officers do a great job, but there was no way to talk directly to the federal government about the nature of the fundamental underlying problems that the states have. There certainly wasn't a mechanism to talk to the Congress as well. So I think we really need something, whether it's ACIR redo or what it is, we really need something that will allow the problems that really exist, the tough problems, whether it's in the energy area, highways, whatever it is, to be discussed, debated, and solutions to be found. We need something, and there isn't anything out there now that I found to be able to help deal with these issues.
Okay. Ray, you get the last word.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't as supportive of those organizations as some other people, but I do think that they were good in keeping the issue of federalism kind of in front of everybody. But I don't think they were particularly good at negotiating out anything. I think the negotiation has to be done basically an agency by agency. I personally think one of the biggest tragedies that we found was on the ACA around the Medicaid provisions, largely because when we opposed parts of the ACA, we got thrown out of the room and never really had any discussions with HHS about the implementation of it. And I think if I look at it now and be honest, I think some of the problems that they're having now is because nobody focuses on the implementation, which in today's world are big, big issues.
Okay. Thank you, Ray. Well, that's about all the time we have for this afternoon's eCademy webcast. In closing, I want to thank our presenters again for sharing their insights and their experiences. And thanks to everyone who tuned in today. This webinar will be archived in the CSG Knowledge Center. So if you missed any part of it, you can listen again, or you can send a link to a friend. Also be sure to keep an eye on csg.org to find out about future events in the eCademy series, as well as information on the other policy areas that the Council covers. So thanks again, and have a good afternoon.